In this part of lesson 3.9, we will learn how to solve quadratic equations using the quadratic formula. You probably remember the quadratic formula from Algebra 1. Quadratic formula can be used to solve any equation as long as it's written in standard form and equal to 0. If it's not written in standard form, or if it's not equal to 0, it will be your job to change it into standard form first before you begin using the quadratic formula. Now, quadratic formula is x over 2a. This is the quadratic formula, and you can notice that there's a little part in bold here underneath the radical. This value has a specific name. This is called the discriminant. And the discriminant is very important because as the value under the square root, it's going to determine how many and what kind of solutions your problem is going to have. If your discriminant is a positive number, then your answer will have two real solutions. And we know that that's just because if you have a positive number under the square root, you're going to get a real answer. The reason why there's two of them is because you're taking the square root of the discriminant, and we know that when you take the square root, you have the positive or the negative solution, which is exactly why your equation has plus or minus right there in front of the square root. Now, some other possibilities for the discriminant. If the discriminant has a value of 0, 0 is a real number. If you take the square root of 0, you just get 0. If you add 0 or subtract 0 in the quadratic formula, you will end up with one real solution. And as you can imagine, if the value under the square root is a negative number, here you're going to end up with imaginary answers, but you'll still get two imaginary answers because of the plus or minus in the formula. So two imaginary solutions. And again, the discriminant is just the value underneath the radical. It doesn't actually include the square root itself. All right, let's take a look at some problems. Example 1, we're going to be solving the equation 2x squared plus 7x minus 4 equals 0. This one's already written in standard form. It is already equal to 0. So I can just look at this equation and determine that the value of a, which is the number out in the very front, is 2. I see that b is 7, because that's the number that is attached to x. And the value of c is negative 4, because I have this minus 4 at the back. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be plugging in the values of a, b, and c. And up here at the top of here, quadratic formula x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all divided by 2a. So that's our values of a, b, and c into the correct place of the formula. So formula in the beginning says negative b. So for b, I'm going to plug in 7 plus or minus square root of b squared. So again, for b, I'm going to plug in 7 minus 4 times a times c. So for a, I'm going to plug in 2, and for c, I'm going to plug in negative 4. In the denominator, the formula says 2 times a. So for a, I'm going to plug in 2. Now, plugging the numbers in, you do have to be very careful, but that's a fairly easy step. Step 2, what we want to do is simplify. We want to bring things down and calculate small chunks of the problem at a time. So up top, we have negative 7. So I'm going to bring that down as just negative 7. In the denominator, on the very bottom, we have 2 times 2, which is 4. I'm just going to bring that down. And then underneath the square root, this is where I'm going to use my calculator, and I'm going to type this into my calculator exactly the way that it appears here. I'm not typing in the square root just yet. I'm calculating the discriminant. Remember, this value underneath the square root is called the discriminant. So I want to calculate this value. So 7 squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 4. And I'm using my calculator. Please follow along if you're watching at home. And I get an 81 there. That's my discriminant. That's the number underneath the square root. Well, you're looking at that thinking, hey, I know the square root of 81, and that's exactly what we're going to do next is we're going to simplify that radical. So I'm just going to bring everything down. On top, we have -7 plus or minus the square root of 81. Square root of 81 is 9. And on the bottom, we have a 4. Now, everything I'm looking at here, these are like terms. So I'm going to take care of the plus or minus here. We're going to do this twice. We're going to do -7 plus 9 divided by 4, which -7 plus 9 is 2. Divided by 4 is 1/2. That's our first answer down here. Now we're going to go back and do the minus. -7 minus divided by 4. That would be -16 divided by 4, which is -4. That's my second solution. So just like the other examples we've seen, we end up with 2 answers here. The reason why we end up with 2 answers is because when you take the square root of 81, it could be +9 or -9. That's the reason why the formula has the plus or minus. Let's take a look at another example. Here we go. Solving x squared plus 4x plus 13 equals 0. This is already set up for us in standard form. So we want to get our values for a, b, and c. I see that there's only one x squared here, so a equals 1. Plus 4x, so b is 4. Plus 13, so c equals 13. Now what we want to do is we want to take those numbers and we want to plug them into the correct, write it in a different color so we can see it really well. -b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all divided by 2a. Into the right places. So the formula says -b. So for b I'm going to plug in 4 plus or minus square root of b squared. So again for b I'm going to plug in 4 minus 4 times a times c. So for a I'm going to plug in 1 and for c I'm going to plug in 13. On the bottom we have 2 times a. That'll be 2 times 1. Now that we have all the numbers plugged in, we will begin using our calculator to simplify. So here we're just going to bring stuff down. The beginning says -4, so I'm just going to bring down the -4. On the bottom we have 2 times 1, which is just 2. And underneath the radical, so using my calculator, but not actually typing in the square root yet, just calculating the discriminant. The value under the radical, I'm going to use my calculator. 4 squared minus 4 times 1 times 13. I'm calculating -36. All right, so we've got a negative under there. And you're looking at that and you're thinking, oh, I know the square root of 36 is 6. But what's the square root of -36? Well, that's going to be an imaginary number. So up top, we've got -4 plus or minus 6i. Because the square root of 36 is 6, so the square root of -36 is 6i. Divided by 2, just bringing that 2 down. Now, in the last example, we started adding the top together and subtracting the top and dividing by 2. The problem with this one is you have -4 plus or minus 6i. The 6 is imaginary and the -4 is not. These are not like terms. We can't actually add them together. So all we can do is simplify our fraction. So if you look at the -4, the 6, and the 2, they are all divisible by 2. So what we'll end up with, -4 divided by 2 is -2. 6 divided by 2 is 3i. You could put this thing over 1, but you don't have to. And then the other answer would be -2 minus 3i. So I just wanted to show you that we can write these. The plus or minus still represents 2 answers here. negative 2 plus 3i, and negative 2 minus 3i. Let's try one last example. We're going to solve 5x squared equals 6x minus 3. Now for the first time, this one is not written in standard form. What we need to do before anything else is set the equation equal to 0. So since this is a positive 6x, we will subtract 6x and move it over here to the other side. This is a negative 3, so we will add 3 and move it over to the other side. So what we end up with is 5x squared minus 6x plus 3 equals 0. And it is important when you do this, you have to put those values in order. The x squared has to be first, and then the minus 6x has to be second, and the plus 3 has to be third. Once you have it written like this, you can get your a value is 5 because we have 5x squared. B is negative 6 because we have negative 6x here. And C is a positive 3 because our constant is a positive 3. So we're going to go through the formula up at the top of our page so we have it to reference. B plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac, all divided by 2. So the first part of the formula is negative b. So for b, we're going to plug in negative 6. Plus or minus square root of b squared. And again for b, we're going to plug in negative 6. Minus 4 times a times c. Well, a, I'm going to plug in a 5, and for C, we're going to plug in a 3. And on the bottom, 2 times A, we're going to plug in a 5. From here, like before, we're going to go through and we're going to simplify. Negative, negative 6. 2 negatives are going to make that a positive 6. On the bottom, 2 times 5 is going to make that a 10. And then we need to calculate this value underneath the square root called the discriminant. We want to be very careful calculating this. We want to calculate just the way that it appears. Parentheses and everything are going to be very important here when you're dealing with negatives. So negative 6 squared minus 4 times 5 times 3. That's going to be a negative 24. Now this time I'm looking at that negative 24 and I'm thinking, what in the world is the square root of negative 24? I don't even know the square root of positive 24. It's a decimal. So what we're going to do is we're going to come off to the side here, and we are going to simplify this radical as much as we possibly can. So if I don't know the square root of negative 24, I need to break it down using a number that I do know the square root of. So let's see, 24 is divisible by 4. I know that 4 times 6 equals 24. And I'm going to think of that as a negative 4 times 6 to get negative 24. And even though I don't know the square root of 24, I do know the square root of negative 4 is 2i, and that'll leave the 6 under the square root. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring everything down, and we're going to simplify that radical. So we bring down the 6, we bring down the 10, but instead of the square root of negative 24, we're going to I square root of 6. Now again, this is imaginary. It also has a square root, so we cannot combine like terms across the top. You can't put 6 plus 2 is like 8i. We can't do that because they're not like terms. All you can do is look at your coefficients, the 6, the 2i, and the 10. Kind of ignore the square root for right now. All you can do is look at those and figure out what they're all divisible by. Here, these are all divisible by 2, so we can simplify this fraction. 6 divided by 2 is 3. 2i divided by 2 is just going to be 1i, and we leave that square root of 6 alone. And 10 divided by 2 on the bottom is 5. So this is our final answer. You could actually write it as 2 separate answers. You could write it as 3 plus I square root of 6 over 5. And then your second answer would be 3 minus I square root of 6 over 5. So just because I've written it as one piece, there's still 2 answers here.